It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Officer Daniel Hayes received the 911 dispatch. Child caller. Male, around 3 or 4. Location, 114 Elm Avenue. Says his grandpa isn't waking up. Dan's heart tightened. A child calling 911 was never a routine call. He flicked on the cruiser lights and sped through puddle-streaked streets toward the address. Elm Avenue was an aging neighborhood, crooked mailboxes, peeling paint, silence thicker than the air. The house at 114 stood out not because it was well kept, but because it looked forgotten. Curtains hung askew. The grass had grown wild. Dan approached with caution. He knocked once. Silence. Then a faint cry. "Hello," he called, easing the door open. Inside was dim and musty. The furniture was old, the walls yellowing. And there, near a faded couch, stood a small boy in dinosaur pajamas, tiny, trembling, phone still in his hand. "Are you Liam?" Dan asked, lowering to his knees. The child nodded, lip quivering. "Grandpa won't wake up." Dan followed his gaze. On the floor beside the couch, an elderly man lay still. Dan moved quickly, checking vitals, shallow breathing. Faint pulse, but no visible wounds. No signs of trauma. Relief washed over him. The man wasn't dead, but something was clearly wrong. "Buddy, you did so good calling us," Dan said gently, trying to comfort the child. He called for paramedics, then wrapped a blanket around Liam's shoulders. "Is it just you and Grandpa here?" Liam nodded again. "Mama gone." "Daddy gone too." "Gone where?" The boy's silence said everything. The way his eyes looked down, the way his arms hugged himself, Dan knew abandonment when he saw it. As the paramedics arrived and began treating the grandfather, later identified as Mr. Henry Carter, age 72, Dan sat with Liam on the porch. The child clung to his arm like it was the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Dan asked softly. "I was watching cartoons," Liam whispered, then Grandpa fell. He was shaking. Then he stopped. I tried to wake him, but he just laid there. His little voice broke. "I got scored." Dan's throat tightened. "You were very brave, Liam. You helped your grandpa." As medics loaded Henry into the ambulance, one of them whispered to Dan, "Looks like a stroke." Probably had warning signs, but no one caught them. Dan looked at the boy again. "No one was here to catch them," he murmured. Back at the station, Dan stayed after his shift. Something about Liam stuck with him. He pulled up the Carter's records, no next of kin, no active phone numbers. The child had no formal guardian. CPS would need to get involved. But Dan couldn't sleep that night. The image of Liam in those tiny pajamas, alone, calling for help, haunted him. So the next day, Dan visited the hospital. Henry was stable but unconscious. A nurse told him he was trying to care for the boy, but he's not well. He's been skipping meds, likely overwhelmed. Later that evening, Dan stopped by the hospital's playroom, where CPS had temporarily placed Liam. He brought a small plush dinosaur. Liam's face lit up for a brief second, but faded just as fast. "I want to go home," he murmured. Dan knelt beside him. "I know, buddy. But until Grandpa gets better, they need to make sure you're safe." Tears welled up in Liam's eyes. "I don't want scary house. But I don't want no one either." Dan placed the dinosaur in Liam's lap. "You're not no one, Liam. And you're not alone." The next few weeks saw a quiet transformation. Dan, off duty, started checking in on Liam. He brought coloring books, told funny stories about his police dog, and sometimes just sat beside the boy when he didn't feel like talking. The case also opened Dan's eyes to something bigger: isolation. Henry Carter had fallen through the cracks. A widower with no income, trying to raise a child he should have been relaxing with. No support system, no neighbors who cared enough to knock. Dan started talking to others in the department, suggesting community, visits to elderly guardians, wellness checks, school outreach programs. What began as one child's emergency call started shaping a wider change. One crisp morning, almost 4 weeks later, Dan received a call from the hospital. "Henry's awake," they said. "He keeps asking for Liam." Dan brought Liam in personally. When the child saw his grandfather sitting up in bed, pale but smiling, he ran into his arms. "I missed you, Grandpa." Henry cried freely. "You saved me, boy. You called for help. You're my little hero." A few months later, Elm Avenue saw a subtle change. The bungalow at 114 was still old, but the grass was trimmed. A neighbor volunteered to help repaint the fence. Volunteers brought food. Social workers checked in. Dan had unofficially become Liam's Uncle Cop. And the community seemed to have awakened. Liam had inspired something no policy had managed to: human connection. Officer Dan Hayes often recalled that rainy morning as the day a child reminded him why he wore the badge. It wasn't for the chases or the arrests, but for moments like that, when a little boy's tears and courage sparked a chain of kindness that no one could ignore. And somewhere inside a small, patched-up house on Elm Avenue, a 4-year-old slept peacefully beside his recovering grandfather, a tiny dinosaur tucked in his arms, and a future filled with hope.